Yale Winter Carnival invitation to the debate tournament. Representing His Majesty's government is a team from MITA. The team consists of the Prime Minister, Phil La Rochelle, and the Minister of the Crown, Adam Nurkowski. Representing Her Majesty's loyal opposition is a team from Hart, Yale. Consisting of the member of the opposition, Aaron Strauss, and the leader of the opposition, Aaron Rousseau. The resolution before the House today is that God is away on business.
God is
I would like to invite the Prime Minister to introduce the government's case in a 6-minute speech.
Maybe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shapiro, Speaker of the House. Thank you, Kristen McGill, for a fantastic tournament. I love coming here. And especially an honor for a boy from Beaconsfield and a boy from Outremont to come to a homecoming and be here in the final round. So thank you very much. We have some Canadian and American themes in this round, as you might have seen. And what we want to do on side government is that we want to mix the best of Canadian morality, which what we would say is one of the staples of American jurisprudence. What we're going to say, Mr. Speaker, is that if you were to found a utopia, a country whose level of wealth is on the level of the United States or Canada, and you've decided to have an American-style constitution, what we on side government are going to say is that you should include economic rights in your constitution on the things that you would find in your constitution. So, in current constitutions, the government has an obligation to provide a fair trial, equal protection. What we're saying is that the government has an obligation to provide minimum standards of food, housing, and medicine to all of its citizens. And basically, here's how it would work. If someone doesn't believe the government is fulfilling its obligations, they can bring the government to court, and the court can basically order the government to do something. The court system does this now. Like in the United States, the court system basically orders things like busing, having segregation, anti-segregation policies. So this is something which can happen. So having said that, I want to give you 3 reasons as to why Adam and I believe it is absolutely fundamental to having this utopia that you include economic rights in your Constitution. And the first thing that we want to talk about is the proper role of the government. Now, a Constitution outlines the obligations of the government, delineating its most important functionings and ensuring that these things get fulfilled despite day-to-day sentiments. So we have 3 reasons as to why we think the proper role of government necessitates basically having economic rights within the Constitution. The first thing is that we would say that a proper government looks out for the welfare of the citizenry. Now, the government distributes resources according to increasing welfare, but what we would say is that the government has to take into account the fact of diminishing marginal returns. And if the government really wants to create the most welfare within the society, it has to realize that you can have the most amount of welfare if you happen to concentrate relatively small portions of funds to the lowest classes within your society. It is the role of the government to disproportionately look out for the worst off in society if it really wants to look out for the welfare of society as a whole. Sure.
Just as clarification, when you say economic rights, can you exemplify? Because, for example, the covenant on economic, cultural, and social rights includes like paid holidays.
No, what we're saying is basic economic rights to the level of like making sure that everyone has a place to stay. Like in New York City, there's actually something which is written in the city charter which says everyone needs to have housing in New York City if they want it. What we would say is that like it's quite easy to delineate like these basic medical costs, which are basically like covered by the Canadian healthcare system, and the basic necessities of food. We hope this won't be an issue, but we think it's pretty clear that any sane society can delineate what exactly it is that are the basic necessities of economic rights. But the second thing I want to talk about is hierarchy of needs. Because what we would say is that we qualify something as a right when it's essential to human dignity and proper existence. And we would say that nothing fits this definition better than the basic needs which are outlined by economic human rights. Like, I don't even think I need to say this, especially in Canada. But the truth of the matter is that although we may consider freedom of speech to be fundamental, we would say that if someone doesn't have enough food to eat, enough medicine to be able to be free of disease, homelessness, and the basic impediments which come from not having economic rights, we say that's just as much of a violation of human dignity as if you were denied freedom of speech, as if you were denied all the other things which are legally constitutional. But the last thing that we're going to say is the idea of equal benefit from governments. Because what we would say is that libertarians often argue that, well, it's like you're stealing from the wealthy and giving to the poor, that's not fair. But we'd say that there's 2 main roles of government. One is redistributing wealth, and the second is enforcing laws and basically protecting property. While the poor do benefit mostly from redistribution of wealth, we say that the wealthy benefit disproportionately from the idea that the government protects property, and since they have most of the property, governments are actually benefiting from it. There has to be a balance which has to be in the Constitution. But the second thing we're going to talk about is the importance of economic rights to other rights. And the first thing that we want to talk about under this is that economic rights are essential to freedom. Now, the fundamental idea in Western societies is that of freedom. But philosophers have basically outlined two basic impediments to freedom. One is oppressive governments and other oppressive external agents, but the second one is need. Like, if freedom is the ability to engage in the pursuits that I deem to be worthwhile, if I'm concentrating on getting enough food to eat, or how it is that I can have health care for my kids, I'm not free to pursue and be part of this great world where I can have the freedom to pursue what we happen to think are very important predicates for having a good life. But the second thing I want to talk about is meritocracy in the pursuit of happiness. Because we'd all like to think that we're in a great race, where the most entrepreneurial and the person who works hardest is going to get ahead. But what if I told you that some people were starting 50 meters behind everyone else? Or if someone had to go through the entire race with a steel ball attached to their leg? The point is that if we want to have a true meritocracy, what needs to happen is there has to be a delineation that we have a reasonable equalization of the playing field. And when you have a true meritocracy, everyone in society is better off. That's what we own government believe. But the last thing I want to talk about, the third large area of analysis, is I want to talk about specifically why it's important to have economic rights in a constitution as opposed to simply trying to get it accomplished through legislative means. And the first thing that we want to talk about is that we want to say that these basic necessities are inviolable. Now, there are certain characteristics of human existence that we think are so important that we include them in a constitution. Like, we say that it's so important not to be tortured that we place it into a constitution so that even if the majority of people happen to think that, like, it's okay to torture you, we still don't think that's okay. What we would say is that even if 95% of the population, for one reason or another, because they don't think that they'll be facing that situation themselves, happen to think that the government doesn't have an obligation to look after the worst off in society, we would say, just like the case of torture, just like the case where you want to look at for individual liberties, aside from what the majority wants, we think you have to go ahead and do it. But the last thing I want to talk about as to why this has to be in a constitution is that we want to talk about political power. Because what we would say is that the people who need this most, the poor, don't have the resources to use democratic political channels in the usual sense. What we would say is that the court system represents the easiest, most accessible outlet for the poor to actually have their grievances channeled, whereas the ability to actually raise enough political support to address these grievances is much harder than simply getting a lawyer and bringing something before the courts. For all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, we are
constructive remarks and 7 minutes. Right.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. A big thank you to the McGill tournament for running an amazing tournament, by far better than any tournament run in the United States of America. And to let me wear this robe, this is really awesome. With that understood, though, while the tournament definitely runs better than in America, I think that some of the things that America does in terms of how they provide for their citizens are right on. That's why we're going to oppose this case. We're going to do it with 3 independent areas of analysis right here. The first thing that I want to talk is broad analysis of state of nature theory, right? The kind of stuff that you were expecting us to say, right? Obligation of government, what we're supposed to do. The second thing we want to talk about is how this cheapens the idea of rights that are more important, rights that need to be protected. And the third thing we're going to talk about, the practical effects it's going to have on the economic market if the government gets involved in providing all these services. What's the first thing we're talking about? We're going to talk about state of nature theory. Just a quick debriefing, because we're all debating, right? We all know this. So the idea behind this is that the government is going to restrict rights, and Phil even senses this because he tries to prevent this. He says, look, well, they might be upset because you're taking money from the rich people. But dang right we're upset. We're upset because you've got some sort of justification for why you can take this money. Some sort of reason why people would agree to be in a society where they can have their money taken, the money that they've earned, you assume, and given to someone else. Now, the justification we normally offer is that the government provided something that cannot be provided in the state of nature, cannot be provided when there is no government. But when we look at something such as shelter, when we look at something such as food, you can provide that for yourself in the state of nature, and can provide yourself for yourself in a normal capitalistic democratic society. What can't you provide for yourself in the state of nature? You can't provide protection from people who are stronger than you in the state of nature. You can't provide protection from whoever happens to be taller and stronger and bigger than you. So we give up some rights in order to form a police force. We say this is an okay restriction on my liberty, because I can't provide that for myself in the state of nature. But I can provide housing. I can provide a lot of the economic benefits they're getting, and unless they tell us that somehow we can't do this, somehow I can't go out and kill a deer when I want to, we say that, well, I mean, I can't. We say that no one else can justify the need for these people to have these rights restricted.
Your theory, while interesting, is no reason as to why it's the theory we should go with. Like, what we would say is that a just government doesn't care whether or not, like, you would be able to protect yourself or get food in the abstract. It cares about the fact that you don't have food now, and a just society would ensure that you actually do get it.
But the reason that society exists is not to provide you food. The reason that society exists, it takes away certain rights from you. It takes away rights that you could be able to exercise without that society. The importance is to recognize what your life would be like without that society. And if the creation of that society restricts what you can do, takes away liberties from you, there needs to be a justification for that, or society just shouldn't exist. If all the benefits I get from a government would be provided without a government, why would I restrict my liberty in ways the government does do and needs to do? I wouldn't do it. I would never agree to it. No rational actor would. The only reason why I would is if I get a benefit that I couldn't otherwise receive. We think that food and shelter, while we do agree, and we don't want to get painted emotionally here as well, the poor people don't have a home, we do believe that is adequate shelter to live and can be provided in the state of nature. The second thing we want to talk about is cheapens the idea of rights. Mr. Speaker, while they try and give us some sort of analysis that to say economic rights are just as important as everything else, we think we probably all recognize there are more important rights than whether or not you have a lot of food versus some food. Also recognize that the American system and every liberal democracy provides some sort of welfare net, provides some sort of thing that we won't let any of our people absolutely starve. We will provide for the most basic needs. So what they're talking about, unless they're saying the way everything works is cool, which I don't think their case is, what they're talking about is providing something on top of it. Once you do that, once you say that this is a right, you have a right to have more than what is absolutely necessary. Once they say that, that is just a right to be equal and weighed against the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to free speech. We say that cheapens those rights and the protection of them. We say those are the rights that cannot be violated. That's why we call them rights. Sure.
Even if we happen to think that it's true that there is this difference in the importance of rights, like we may have the Fifth Amendment, which is really important, like the right not to self-incrimination, but we still have the Fourth Amendment, which is like a quartering knife. The point is like, even though there might be a disparity in how the rights are, if they're worthy of being in the Constitution, they're in the Constitution.
We say that you can weigh those rights, but the point is you start extending a right to anything that you believe to be important. What they're really saying is, we think this should be done, therefore we'll call it a right. That's not what rights are supposed to be. Rights are not supposed to be, but it sure would be cool if we did this, and we really probably should do this. Rights are things that means that the violation of those rights or really practical concerns can never be done. You've got to show some other rights violation in order to take away someone's rights. We'd like to see that from them as a justification for doing so. We don't think they give us one. The final thing we want to talk about independently are the practical effects on the market. Recognize, Mr. Speaker, members of this panel, members of most of this House, and my row, recognize that when the government gets into the business of providing most of these services, which we think, recognize obviously the obvious free rider problems associated with it, and that goes without saying, when the government's in the market of providing these services, it totally skews the market for these services. We're not talking about obscure services like providing like bread and soup that people will live. We're talking about housing. We're talking about, what are the other examples they give us? We're talking about medicine. We're talking about food. If the government has a requirement to provide medicine, what does that do to the cost of medicine? When medical companies realize the government has to buy their products, what does that do to the cost of medicine? People would otherwise buy the product on their own. What does it do for the cost of the government? We're talking about costs so obviously in a capitalist society, because it was utopia. It must be capitalist or God bless America. Out of control, that means more tax dollars taken from people who earn the money and have a right to it as a part of the liberty. Let's quickly go through their arguments. I'm sorry, this whole 7-minute Canadian MO thing. The first thing that they talk about is the proper role of government. I've talked about this in state nature theory. They said it's supposed to distribute resources against diminished marginal terms. We don't necessarily think, and they certainly don't give a philosophical basis, that it's a just society must be a redistributive society. We don't think that it is necessary for government to redistribute. Now, obviously, we're all left-wing pansies, so we all believe that it should. We think there's a difference between distributing for the very basic needs in order that someone may continue to live, and distributing to the point that they're talking about, which is distributing to the point of providing housing that you're out of order. Providing housing to this level that they're talking about. We think that while we all are repulsed by it, we think that someone who is homeless is not having their life threatened by being homeless. Now, we don't obviously on this side want to support homelessness. We obviously, I'm not going to go sleep in a ditch right now, but we want you to recognize that the government only has to do to provide for when someone is in imminent danger of dying and needs to protect the life, not provide a certain level. We wonder, where will this level ever stop? If you require certain housing, how will we not, if we implement their plan, in 10 years, another debate round in the finals of McGill will be like, well, we need higher standards. There's not providing enough housing. We think that this is where they're going. When you stop providing just very basic needs, you never know when you stop and when you reach the point that the government is doing what they're supposed to be doing on their side of the house. We're very proud of them.
He's really hurting.
I'd like to thank members of remarks and call upon the reconstruct the government in 7 minutes.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Speaker, Dr. Shapiro, honorable opposition, and the entire Yale tournament for once again providing a wonderful day. Thank you very much, guys. Yale is great. So, what's not so great is the arguments we get on Set Up. So, the first thing he talks about is the state of nature. He sort of says, well, we all know that the correct theory of the political process is sort of revolving the state of nature, and so let's just assert that that's the case, and sort of draw out of that the exact opposite conclusion from what Rawls drew out from his theory of experiments, right? His basic argument is that, like, the state of nature says that the only thing a government should provide for you is what you cannot get for yourself. Like, I don't really know a philosophical justification for this argument. First of all, our conception of rights, I think, is more coherent, which is rights are something that are essential to human dignity, right? The reason we protect freedom of speech is we feel the capacity to speak is essential to the essential dignity of a human being, right? The capacity for a fair trial, it's fundamentally unfair to an individual that can't be tried fairly. We think that you cannot have human dignity, you can't be dignified as a human individual unless you have enough food to eat. It's the most basic kind of right that we should guarantee to our citizens. That is our conception of rights, and I think that's much more Second of all, I'd like to sort of draw a sort of similarity between the idea of positive and negative rights, right? Considering the following case. So there's an apple tree, right? And there's a rich guy who has an apple tree on his property because he inherited, and there's a poor guy that's not on his property. According to their conception of rights, if the poor guy tries to take an apple, then because it's a property rights violation, government should sort of go in. But if the rich guy tries to get the apple, well then the poor guy doesn't have a right to redistribution of that apple tree. The point is, in one case, the government is just arbitrarily saying, well, a correct role of government is to protect the rich person from the poor person, but not the other way around. We think that's fundamentally arbitrary, right? We think that poor person is entitled to sort of basic sort of food also. In this particular case, I don't really understand why it's more moral for the government only to protect the rich guy, for the laws only to apply to the protection of rich people's property rights. My third response is the idea of like rational actors, right? They're like, a rational actor would never enter society wanting to agree with us. I disagree, right? I think that if I'm a rational actor and I don't know my place in society, if I don't know if I'm rich or poor, I don't know if I'm homeless or not, I don't know where I was, who my parents were, something like that, I would want these kinds of rights. I want the guarantee that I basic human rights. If I'm rich, it's really a very small sacrifice, but if I'm poor, my life is essentially, okay, just 1 second, Aaron, it's essentially horrible without these kinds of capacities. Go. Now, John Rawls, they're making the Rawlsian argument that you somehow believe in the veil of ignorance of what we wouldn't want. That's not what state of nature theory says, Adam. State of nature theory says what you couldn't have in a state of nature, not what you just might want in your utopia.
Like, asserting a theory throughout the history of politics is not like an argument, right? Like, this is very
I can tell.
I see no particular moral justification for this theory. Actually, I also like to go in a different way. They're like, I could never provide it for themselves. There's a lot of poor people in society for whom it's essentially impossible to provide themselves with food. Some of them have mental illness. Some of them are born to homeless parents. A lot of people are in this situation. They're born into society where it's extremely difficult for them to provide for their own basic needs because of ultimately circumstances outside of their own control. Even if you apply their state of nature theory, for these individuals, it should still be a right. The second argument they give you is like, it cheapens the idea of rights. And this is basically from the first argument. Well, my first argument was that this isn't a right. So my second argument is, it cheapens the idea of rights. Like, we think there's a faulty premise. We think that it's just as fundamental right, because it's just as fundamental to human dignity. But I'd like to make another response, which is the idea of other rights too. They're like, it cheapens the idea of, for instance, a right to free speech, if you also have a right to food. The point is, the fundamental premise of our case, or one of them, which was never responded to by Aaron, is the idea that you cannot often have free speech, you cannot exercise other kinds of freedoms without the basic kind of right. Like, the impediment to free speech isn't just an oppressive government, it's also your own particular circumstance. And if I have no capacity to exercise the basic freedoms, the life, liberty, and happiness, to quote the American Constitution, or the freedom of speech, that essentially I am guaranteed, if it's essentially impossible factually for me to actually exercise these rights, then it's sort of facile to say for the government to say to a poor person, you know, you have these rights, you can exercise them if you're starving, but you at least have the rights. No, thank you. So we think that doesn't cheapen the idea of rights to defend the existence of rights. But then they're like, we provide money anyway, so all we're projecting is just like more food or something like that. No. We're simply saying that these kinds of things, the right to welfare, a certain amount of income, should not be subjected to the vagaries of the political process. That's the goal of putting something in the Constitution, right? Like, our essential argument is as follows. Essentially, when you submit something to the political process, a population could overturn welfare, overturn food stamps. This has happened, or beginning to happen in the United States. That's why we want to put it in the Constitution. It's not so like people can get even more food, or like caviar for them. But the third, they're like, it screws up the market, right? And here's their theory, right? So there's this guy who's like sort of a middle-class individual, and he's sort of in a nice house. And we're like, no, the government can provide me with relatively shitty but acceptable housing. I can move out of my nice house and move into this sort of crappy housing project, right? But the government isn't providing like just one
said here, wonderful services. The point is the government is only providing a bare minimum. Yes?
But if the government has to provide those services, and I'm a provider of those services, and I'm a capitalist entity, won't I charge the government more because I know the government has to buy?
Like, first of all, in the status quo, these kind of problems already exist, and yet the government has things like audits where they essentially don't allow the companies to gouge them that much. Second of all, if you have to look at the status quo, that doesn't really happen to a natural extent. Like, there's food stamps in the United States. The government sets a price or sets a certain amount of food stamps. You don't have like groceries grotesquely increasing prices because they know the government's paying for food stamps. Like, these problems in the status quo, no, solve themselves. Like, this one is, although maybe food stamps cost a little bit more, I don't think the American economy is devastated because poor people get food stamps. That's like a bad argument. I don't know. I mean, for that though, we usually like respond to individual arguments, but maybe Lam decided to not do that this time. So the first argument we talk about is the proper role of government, right? Where we say a fundamental role of government is looking out for the welfare of their citizens, right? Like, it's very easy for them to assert that like, he argues like, we haven't justified a redistributed society. But I think the justification is clear. The idea of the hierarchy of needs, right? I think we need food more than we need freedom of speech. I think it's more fundamental to human dignity. But I also bring an idea of benefits from government, which I never hear any kind of response to, right? They basically make the argument, our argument is as follows. Look, it's unfair, it's unequal to have a government which only benefits certain citizens and not others. If you want to protect property rights, you have a government specifically oriented to protecting the rich person's right to have an extra tree versus the poor person's capacity to eat. I just don't think that this is a fair government. I think a government should try to have services that benefit different citizens equally. The second argument we give you is like economic rights and the relationship to other rights. And the response we basically get is like this sort of slope. What do we expect, right? Like, where are we going to draw the line? Then it's like all poor people demand caveat and stuff like that. First of all, we disagree, right? We think it's possible for a government to define basic minimum standards of living. Like in the status quo, in the United States and Canada, we have like, sort of an abstract freedom of speech. And there's always like, slippery slope. Like, where are we going to draw the line? How much speech can you have? How much speech can you not have? Like, courts decide this sort of thing and establish basic minimum standards. Like, I think it is possible for a government to coherently have minimum standards, which exist in the status quo with things like food stamps. I don't think that like this is going to necessarily get out of control. The last argument we're going to give you is the Constitution. Like, why specifically do we want this in the Constitution and not just in the political process? We think that the difference between Constitution and policy is that constitutional things are inviolable, right? Like, they cannot be changed even if a majority of the population want to change them. That's why we want to put this in the Constitution. I'm going to focus on the idea of political power. Look, poor people have a very difficult time in the political process because you need money to participate. By sending this to the judiciary, you have people a second kind of resource outside of the political process. For all these reasons, we are proud to
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find this case to be tremendously interesting, and I really like it. Fundamentally, it comes down on the government side to the issue of whether or not these things are inherent rights rather than something else. And what I want to do in my speech is examine several possible justifications for things like for economic rights as inherent rights rather than something else. And I want to show you how most of the major theories, or all of the major theories that we have to draw on from philosophy, from political theory, show us that they are not. My partner has already discussed one about the state of nature. I'm going to come back to it towards the end. But I want to offer you two others. I want to talk about the idea of the social contract, and I'll also discuss the idea, like Greg Rawls too, of availabilities. And I'm going to talk about what contingent rights, which I'm going to suggest these are, would actually mean. So the first idea that I want to introduce is the idea of the social contract. And what the social contract posits is this. It's kind of a philosophical thought experiment. It says, how do we know whether or not a measure that the government takes is justified? We would know because people would be willing to, in the state of nature, would be willing, it comes up a lot, would be willing to sacrifice one liberty that they have. For example, the liberty to kill their neighbor, if everyone else also has to sacrifice that same liberty. So in this situation, obviously, it represents a tremendous net gain for me if I sacrifice my liberty to kill my neighbor, because probably my neighbor's not that bad. But on the other hand, I gain quite a bit because my neighbor's not able to kill me. And, well, we all like our own lives quite a bit. I like myself. So this is the idea of benefit in the aggregate. And that's what underlies the social contract. It's the idea of whether or not people would be willing to sacrifice this liberty if they were theoretically presented with the option. Right.
You're sort of taking tunnel vision. It's like, it may be true, like a rich person may not care about ever paying for housing projects in Brooklyn. The truth is that they appreciate other facts of the social contract, so it's not the necessity that like every single possible rich person in society actually want to contract into.
No, actually, that kind of is actually the social contract. What you're talking about is if you didn't know where you were in society, would you really agree to this? And that's actually my second argument, which is John Rawls' argument of the veil of ignorance. If you didn't know whether or not you were going to be rich, whether you were going to be poor, whether you were going to be highly talented, or whether you weren't going to be highly talented, would you agree to certain social arrangements? And we see from whether or not people would agree without knowing where they are, so there'd be a biased judge, if those social arrangements are just. And what they're saying on their side of the house is that fundamentally having economic rights, the right to housing, the right to a decent meal, the right to health care, so on, these things represent things, values that people aren't going to be willing to sacrifice if they aren't sure that they're going to get them once they're out there in the real world. What I'm going to suggest, and this has been presented as a major flaw with Rawlsian theory, is that it's not simple for us to decide, for us to figure out what people would agree and what they wouldn't agree, because it assumes that people are very risk-averse. What we would suggest is that people are perhaps willing to take the chance, that people are perhaps willing to say, it's going to be so much nicer for me that I can be really rich and really wealthy, but I'm willing to take that chance. And because the veil of ignorance hasn't been able to overcome the fact that these people would agree to certain arrangements, the veil of ignorance, not knowing where you are, doesn't provide justification. The idea of an economic right is going to take care of you whether or not you end up getting the short end of the stick when you come out into the world.
So you're actually saying that people would say, well, I'm going to risk essentially horrible poverty and never able to exercise my other rights, so just like I have the chance to have a few extra dollars,
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're arguing. And in fact, you can see some support for this idea if you look at people in the United States who actually themselves are poor, but who still don't support the idea of redistribution. Because they hope in their life someday they're going to win the lottery, they're going to be rich, and they're going to say, oh wow, now I don't have to pay for those crappy social programs that I used to pay for. Those people aren't willing to agree to a situation that would benefit the poorest in society, then plainly, given that there's a chance you wouldn't be among the poorest, you wouldn't be willing to agree from behind the veil of ignorance. Okay, Mr. Speaker, so where does this lead us? This leads us to the idea of contingent rights. And contingent rights are something which is different from inherent rights. And we've established that people don't have some fundamental prior right or entitlement to these rights. What we suggest is that these rights are then granted by decision. These rights are granted by consensus, granted by the act. And if that's the case, Mr. Speaker, then they shouldn't be in the Constitution. Because what the Constitution is meant to be is something to protect rights that can't be overridden, because those rights simply are inherent and it would be wrong, and it doesn't matter what you decide, you can't override those rights. But if it's simply about a decision that we make together about a right we would like to protect, then it's a contingent right, and it's not the type of thing that belongs in a Constitution. And I would suggest, as I already foreshadowed in response to the point of information, that Canadians and Americans aren't likely to agree to these ideas of these particular contingent rights. So even if you were going to put contingent rights into the Constitution, which you shouldn't, you wouldn't be putting these contingent rights into the Constitution as evidenced by the fact that we don't have them in our Constitution, and there's no movement to put them in our Constitution. People don't like the idea of a right to a job, of a right to a decent house. Even in Canada, we don't have it enshrined in our Constitution that you have the right to health care. It's something we have simply as a matter of social policy. Go ahead.
Like, would you say that if, like the majority, 60% of people were happy with the status quo and just wanted to ban freedom of speech, if there was no inclination towards freedom of speech on the part of a democracy, would you therefore say we shouldn't include it?
And under the question of if I had agreed that freedom of speech was a contingent right, yes, I would. However, given my earlier argumentation, freedom of speech is not, in my view, a contingent right. Freedom of speech is something that's inherent. Freedom of speech is part of thought. Freedom of speech is part of having a democratic society. Freedom of speech represents then an inherent right, if you follow me. So what they've really put together on their side of the house, and I think it's interesting, and it does sound good, but I'm going to repeat it, is the idea that these rights are flowing principally from the idea of human dignity. And so they say that we can't, it's an infringement upon your human dignity to have to live in abject poverty. But we're going to say, Mr. Speaker, that I don't think it's the idea of the poverty itself in an absolute sense that's really what they're talking about as something that's, a violation of human dignity. Because 50 years ago, most people were actually living what we would consider now to be abject poverty. Where they didn't have decent food, they didn't have decent housing, they didn't have reliable medicine. These people weren't living in that. So what we say, Mr. Speaker, is that it's not a question of the absolute level of poverty, it's a question of the relative level of poverty. And if we want to challenge the idea that it's wrong to have an inequitable distribution of wealth in society, then that's what impinges upon human dignity, not having something relative to what other people have, then that's a question about rights stemming from fundamental equality that should become an equality of outcome. And I don't think that's what they're going to stand on that side of the House, but that's what their arguments about dignity lead you to. So what did we hear? That was new. What did we hear from the Prime Minister? The Prime Minister tells us that this is about the role of government. And one of the roles of government is to presumably maximize utility. Because when he suggests that there's a question of diminishing marginal utility, as you give more resources to one person, they start to enjoy each one less. And so what we should do is make sure we don't have that inequitable distribution. But where this leads you to, where this utilitarian idea about diminishing marginal utility, leads you to the idea of perfect equality. And that's something that they haven't spoken of in favor of on that side of the House, and it's something they're not going to stand on. If you truly believe that government is about maximizing utility, then what you're going to do is have perfect equality, with perhaps the caveat that you'll make sure you have a level of inequality necessary to motivate people to work and motivate there to be some level of meritocracy. The second idea that was put forward is the idea that economic rights are essential to freedom. And what I'm going to suggest is that there are certain rights that are free, that could be discussed as inherent rights. Things like freedom of speech. And if you perhaps didn't have the resources to give you access to freedom of speech, then that would be that necessary ability to have that right to freedom of speech is a question of inherent rights. But this isn't that issue. Because unless they want to suggest that you need to have adequate housing to be able to have something which is an inherent right, then they can't suggest that it's an inherent right. And until they can explain to me what it is beyond absolute poverty or relative inequality that they believe is driving this idea of human dignity, then they can't stand on that side of it. And then I will also argue, pushing this a bit further, that they're not sure about what they have in mind for economic rights. Because what I tell you, as I said in the point of information in the Prime Minister's speech, is that in fact, in the United Nations Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, paid holidays are included in the covenant. I don't think that anybody in this room is going to argue that paid holidays are an inherent right of people. And that paid holidays aren't an inherent right. Paid holidays obviously aren't an inherent right, and they're not the type of thing that's necessary to enjoying rights like freedom of speech, freedom of association. And so I want to argue, question which economic rights we're talking about. And then finally, they suggested that this is about the Constitution. And fundamentally, that it's important to have them in the Constitution. But Mr. Speaker, that's only if you accept the idea that these are inherent rights that can't be overridden. So it's essentially the restatement of the case. And moreover, they said under this point that democracy doesn't work for the poor. To which I say, well, that's an argument about like campaign finance reform. That's an argument about something else. So democracy, don't put it in the Constitution. So, Mr. Speaker, my partner having already examined the state of nature, I've also brought forward the idea of the social contract and the idea of the veil of ignorance. And I've discussed contingent rights and the role of human dignity, along with relative inequality, absolute poverty, and freedoms too. For all of these reasons, we beg to oppose.
I found it very nice. That was a very, very good piece of speech. What badass. Is that a good reference?
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, of course, again, for the Go tournament. Adam for next one. Essentially, what I want to talk about first and foremost is basic liberties and what it is that we qualify as rights. Because I think that we've heard a lot of challenges and we've had a lot of different conceptions as to what it is that we should qualify as a right. And what I want to basically break down as to what a right is it's something that we want to guarantee to every individual within a society. And I think the basic question within this round, which has been ignored by the opposition, sort of throwing out words like contingent and inherent rights, is the basic question of when it comes down to the harms which can be incurred within an individual within society. Is it the case that we want to guarantee within society the right of everyone to have the basic standards of living which are included within economic rights? And what we would say is that at the end of the day, whether or not it's something which the government actively does or actively restrains itself from doing, what we would say is that the net effect is the same. If you happen to know that harms incur within a society from either actively doing something or not actively doing something, what we would say is that there's no inherent moral difference as to guaranteeing one and not guaranteeing the other at the point where the result is the same. And that's where we started our argumentation. We said that the harms which you accrue from economic rights not only are harms in and of themselves, which are like the other things which you would get by being tortured by a government, which would have the exact same impact, which would have the same harms, or worse, as having your freedom of speech restricted. And starting from that point, we would say at the point where rights are a basis for human dignity, we don't see why a government would try to ensure one and not the other at the point where the exact same result is the same. But we've gone further than that. We've said the reason why you want to guarantee a right is that you have to realize that if you want other rights to be important, these are very important for those as well. What have we told you? We've basically told you that if you want to care about freedom, realize that a person who has to constantly worry about getting enough food, getting enough shelter, getting enough medicine, and trying to dig themselves out of a hole within society because they're not given the opportunities to do so, do not have the freedoms which are the very basis for all the other rights in our Constitution. What we've told you is that you can set a basic standard for what are the basic necessities for which people can go on and not be subject to the harms, which we would say are equivalent to the kind of harms when they're actually acted upon by other individuals or acted upon by a government. And what we would say is that you can set these standards and you can have an evolving standard just like we have in other societies. We've basically heard, what is this standard? Like, will people be demanding pink Cadillacs within 10 years because they think that that's the appropriate thing you should get within economic rights? No. We always delineate within standards. Like, look at cruel and unusual punishment. Cruel and unusual punishment is an evolving standard where we basically said, like, in the past we had this societal standard, and we've decided, rationally, not like crazy people like the opposition seems to think the government is, that this is the appropriate standard. It's the evolving standard which the government can set, and we have to think that these rights happen to be something which should be guaranteed, but the most fundamental thing which they've never attacked is they've never responded to us why it is that when these harms accrue with the consent of the majority, they're all of a sudden okay. We say that's not okay. That's the very purpose of having a constitution. But the second thing I want to talk about is basic political theory. Because what they've done is they've thrown out political theory, but the question you have to ask is, what's the correct political theory? I don't think Aaron's state of nature theory is any better than the kinds of theories which one could just randomly throw out, which we've projected throughout society. He basically says that you should only give people what they couldn't get in the state of nature. Like, what does this mean? Like, if I can get a club, I can protect myself from another guy. If I can get food, I can feed myself. This simply doesn't make sense in the context of, like, what the state of nature is. I mean, I suppose you could take this theory. We offer you a better theory. We basically say if you want to have a just society, you can look at something of the veil or ignorance, where the true interpretation is not what Aaron gives you in his LO, but clearly someone who's looking at a society and says, look, I can either be a rich person and basically like pay a couple extra $1,000, which would have gone to, I don't know, leather trims on my Mercedes, or I could be a person who's in abject poverty. What we would say is that yes, most people are risk averse. Yes, most people looking at a society would think that the society where there's a guarantee of economic rights, where you're not in this situation, is the far better society. But the last thing I want to end on is, can we have our cake and eat it too? Because what they've said is that you don't want to put these rights on the level of other rights. What we've said is that like you might regard the freedom not to be tortured to be a more important right than like the right to freedom of speech. The point is that if something is very, very important, you stick it in there to the point where you want to make sure that they're assured in a conflict where they don't come into conflict with other rights, where you weigh that as opposed to simply democracy not thinking it's appropriate. Is this going to harm the economy? I don't think that people are all of a sudden going to say, wow, the ghetto looks really good. I all of a sudden want to take advantage of food stamps as opposed to buying the better products. We've shown that you can have other rights. We've shown that this isn't going to harm the economy. Mr. Speaker, we urge for vote.
I would like to thank all the speakers and call this round.